This video is another video in the FastGadgets tutorial series. So if you're my regular viewers, you may or may not want to watch this video. But what we're going to do today is install Windows Server 2008 32-bit edition into VMware Fusion virtual machines. So to get started, I have VMware Fusion installed. So before you can do this, you do have to have some type of virtualization software. It is possible to use VMware Player or VMware Workstation on a Windows machine, and you can also install VMware Player on a Linux machine. Since I'm using a Mac machine for this particular tutorial, I'm going to use VMware Fusion. However, the principles on how you install a virtualized system is basically the same, but the interface may look slightly different. But every step we're going to go through is essentially the same way, whether it's on Windows or it's on Linux or it's on Mac OS. So you of course have to have your virtualization software installed, and the next thing you will need is ISO images. So there's a couple of different ways you can get ISO images. If you're a student at a college, you usually have access to DreamSpark, which I think it's called Microsoft Imagine now, and you can download the required ISOs. If not, you can purchase the software as well, and you can also get trials of much of the Microsoft software that we're going to use. So we're looking for Windows Server 2008. Now they have strange names. In this case I have my ISO for Windows Server 2008, and this one is actually Service Pack 2, and you'll also notice, which I highly recommend, that you use the x86 installation instead of the 64-bit installation. The main reason for that is if you are going to install some type of virtualization software on your own system and it does not have certain support in the BIOS for 64-bit systems, even if it has a 64-bit chip, you will not be able to install anything but 32-bit. So if it has the x86 after it, you know it's a 32-bit. If you see 64, so this one for example is 64-bit, you could install that, or this one below here, the Server 2012 is x64. So if you accidentally install 64-bit and you get all done and it runs fine, no problem. Your machine actually supports 64-bit, so you're all set. If you try to install it and you can't get the installer to work and you get an error, usually the virtual software, VMware, is very good at detecting whether or not your system supports 64-bit. So that's why I'm going to use the 32-bit here. Just makes things a little bit more simple. So to get started, I launch my virtual machine software, which is VMware Fusion 7, and I'm going to click the Add button, and I'll click New, and it'll ask, is it an existing system that I want to import? Because I can actually take a PC and make a virtualized machine of it and then run that virtual machine anywhere I want. In this case I'm going to install from a disk or image, so I'll click Continue. It says choose an operating system to install or disk image, so I'm going to use a disk image. And if I was in Windows, of course, I would be in Explorer. I'm going to go to my portable hard drive and then ISO images. And again, I need that EN Windows Server 2008, which is right here. If I have to, I can increase the screen, or I can just hover the mouse over it and it'll give me the title at some point. Let's see if we can get it to do that. There we go. So I'll click that and then open. Now you do have to be careful when you do the installation. These ISO images actually include many install types. So it would have Windows Server Standard, Windows Server Enterprise, Windows Server Data Center, and in this case we will be using Windows Server Standard. So I'm going to do continue. I'm going to use a simple password, so capital P, the @ symbol, SSW0RD, and I'll repeat it here, capital P @SSW0RD. I don't need a product key for this. We're going to be using this for testing, so we don't actually need to put in a product key, and we can rearm our 30-day trial period several times and extend that, and I'll show you how to do that in a future video. So here I have to choose my Windows version, and again, just as I mentioned, there are several different versions. I want Windows Server 2008 Standard. I do not want Core. Core is a non-graphical interface. It was trying to emulate what Linux systems do, so I'm going to select Standard. And we could make the home folder accessible to the virtual machine. I'll leave that alone for right now, and I'll click Continue. And it warns me that I am not entering a product key, which is fine, so I'll continue without a key. And it shows me what I'm installing and the fact that it's going to use network address translation so that it will network and it'll be on its own separate network. Now I can customize settings, and there's a couple of things that I might consider. One is where it's going to be saved. So right now, and this will be basically the same in Windows, this is very important. If you're installing this on a lab computer in a college and you want to have access to it when you go home, you would want to install it on a portable drive. Now when I say portable drive, it cannot be a simple thumb drive with solid state memory in it. It has to be a portable drive with spinning platters in it, or a portable SSD drive. USB 3 is highly recommended because they're much more faster with disk I/O and access to the system. If you use USB 2, it will function fine, but it's just going to be a little bit slower. So in some cases we may be running more than one virtual machine, and if you're using USB 2 and you're running two virtual machines from the same hard drive, it can be considerably slower. But if that's all you have, that will work fine. Because I am installing this on a personal system, I'm just going to leave it installing in the virtual machines folder as it shows here. But if I wanted to, I could change where it's installing. But this works perfectly fine with me. And it's going to call this system Windows Server 2008. So I'm just going to click Save because where I've put it is perfectly fine. And it's going to go ahead and start the install. Now, since I'm doing this on a MacBook, it brings up the Server 2008 settings. So before I do the install, I could actually make some changes, but the settings that it has are usually just fine for the defaults. But let's have a look. So we have a hard disk with 40 gigabytes, which is perfect. CD, if your computer has a CD DVD, it can use it, but we shouldn't need it because we're going to be dealing with ISO files. Memory, 1024 is probably sufficient. I could boost this up a little bit. This system has 8 gigabytes available, so I could go maybe 1.5 gigabytes. It's only using one processor core, which is usually perfectly fine. So for what I'm doing, this really is good enough. If you don't give it enough memory, it can bog things down a little bit because then it goes to the disk for virtual memory, and we already have virtualized the hard drive, so it would cause more disk I/O on the portable hard drive. So I'm going to go ahead and click play. Now VMware has a really neat feature, and basically what it will do is it will run through the installation for me, and I don't have to do anything. So if you're on VMware Player, VMware Workstation, or VMware Fusion, once you've told it which version of Windows you want to install, it should step through automatically and do the installation for you. Now, after the install is completed, we do have some additional steps that we need to do to install Active Directory, but this will get us our basic virtual machine. So while I'm talking about virtual machines, there's two things that I always try to do. One is I always try to keep all of my ISO images in a folder called ISO images, so they're easy for me to find. And the other thing that I like to do, and you can see that the installation is still proceeding here. If I go to Finder on this Elements drive, I created a folder called Virtual Machines, okay? And we really always want to have a separate folder, and it depends what you're doing it for, but in this case I might create a separate folder for one virtual machine, or I might create a folder for my class if I'm teaching a class, and then inside that folder I could create the other virtual machines that I have. So I've got a completely separate folder for Server 2008 and a completely separate folder for Windows 7, and the reason being is because there's actually many files associated with a virtual machine. So if you have mixed the files, in other words, if these two virtual machines were in one folder, all of their files would be mixed. Although it is possible to separate them, it's a lot of work. Now, if I actually had many virtual machines, and you can see I do have quite a few here, it's possible to have them all in one directory, but if you did that, then it would be just about close to impossible to separate them all, and it's really just too much work. You want to have it neat and orderly. And if I wanted to, I could always launch this VM by clicking the Server 2008 VMX file. So the VMX file is the key. Now in Windows, usually what you see are two boxes, kind of like the logo here for VMware Fusion. So if you have VMware Player installed, you would see these two boxes here, and I could just double click this and launch this virtual machine in the future. It's always best, if you're not absolutely sure which virtual machine you want to launch, to actually go to the folder like I have here where the virtual machine is located and double click the VMX file. That way you know you're running the absolutely correct virtual machine. There is a menu available in VMware which lists all the virtual machines that are installed, but if I didn't change the title, it's possible I could have 4 or 5 virtual machines installed. One of the common problems that I see with novices installing virtual machines is that they will install a VM, and over time they may have 3 or 4 copies of them, and they all are called Windows Server 2008, but they're in separate directories. And if that happens, you can't really tell which machine is which machine. Now we can change the name, but you really want to have all of your virtual machines in separate directories. So Server 2008 is continuing to install, and it's finishing the last few steps of the installation, and we have a progress indicator down here. If your computer is newer and it has an SSD built in, the installation will actually be quite fast, so you're usually not waiting too long. Okay, so I've booted up to my virtual machine, and on Windows you would want to click Control Alt and insert the INS key. On Mac you want to do Function, Control, Option, and Delete, which will send the Control Alt Delete option to this system. Now I have 2 logins, and I think it took this one, it picked up this login from the Mac computer, but the administrative computer we are going to log into, and we're going to change the password because it asks us, and we're going to do a capital P at ssw0rd, capital P at ssw0rd. Then we'll click next. And it says it changed the password, but it really didn't. Or it may have set the password for my other login, Mark Evans. Now I have installed in this machine the VMware tools that are a part of a virtual machine. It was automatically done fairly quickly from the automated process, but you always do have an option to do that. Install the virtual tools that are a part of VMware tools that are a part of a virtual system if you ever need them in the future. So what I'm going to do, I can change the resolution. All I have to do is move and resize the screen and it'll snap it to whatever size I want it to be. I could, if I wanted to, set this time zone, but it did get Eastern correct. I am going to, however, configure networking. Now, keeping in mind that this computer is NATed, so it's using network address translation. And if I actually used a command line, I could do ipconfig, and I can see that my network, my NATed network as set up by VMware is 172.16.35. So in keeping with these particular virtual machines, what I might want to do is use that particular subnet so that I'm always on the same subnet with all the virtual machines that I'm going to use in the future. These steps I'm actually taking from the Lab Manual for Security Plus Guide to Networking Security Fundamentals 4th edition. So if you are interested in following along, you can get that lab book. However, you do not need the lab book for these videos. Everything you need to know I'll show you here. So I do want to set manual IP addresses, and I do think I want to keep it in this IP address range. So since the default gateway is 2 and it looks like it's starting its IP addressing for DHCP at 128, which would be the first IP, I think I'm safe to use the .3 through 127 for manually assigned IPs. So what I'm going to do is write down those numbers, so I have to remember 172.16.35 because that's the network I'm in, and the fact that default gateway is 2. I can just leave this window open if I want, and then I can come back here and click Configure Networking, double click Local Area Connection, go to Properties, TCP IP version 4, and then Properties again. And I can change this to use the following address and do 172, and I'll just check back with my command line again, .16.35, whoops, 172.16.35, and I'll use IP3 because, first of all, I know that 172.16.35.2 is my default gateway. I really won't need a gateway because I'm not really going to worry about getting out on the internet, but if I wanted to, I could put in a DNS server, say, using Google, for example. This is a Google public DNS server, so I could add that if I wanted to. So I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to click Close, and close again. It'll take a few seconds for the network to change the IP, and when it does, I'll do another IP config and we'll make sure that it actually changed the IP address. So I ran IP config again, and you can see that the IP address has actually changed to .3. Now if I want to make sure that I'm actually functional, I can ping 172.16.35.3, well, 2, which is our default gateway. And I'm actually able to ping that, and if I want to see if I have DNS, I could try pinging google.com, and I do. And keep in mind this may not work in labs if you're on a college campus. Okay, so I've changed the IP address. That was one thing I wanted to do. Now let's take a look at the computer name. That's really not something I want. So I'm going to click the link for computer name. And notice that this is just a description. I actually need to click change here. And I'm going to make this something server. You can really put it as anything you want. If I'm following the lab manual for Security Plus, they would like to call it server. I don't have a domain right now, so I'll simply click OK. And I'm going to be warned that I need to reboot. And I will click close. And I'm going to click restart later because I don't want to restart right at this moment. There's a couple other things that I want to deal with. One is automatic updates. We really don't need automatic updates on the system if we're just using it for academic purposes and we're really not going to connect to the internet. Keeping in mind that that connection to the internet is not something I actually need because all the testing I'm going to do is in our NATed private network. We really don't want to connect to the internet because if we're going to use this system as a testing system to say run brute force password guessing against or port scanning, we don't want to accidentally scan the outside world because if we did that, it could possibly cause repercussions for us legally, but also technically speaking. So I'm going to click enable Windows updates and I'm going to click manually configure settings. And the current setting is not configured. I'm going to change this setting to never check for updates. Again, I wouldn't really do this on a production server. As a matter of fact, I would not even let this system see the internet if it was a production server because I haven't even done the updates yet. Well, let me rephrase that. I wouldn't let the internet see this server instead of the server see the internet because it would need the internet to make those changes. And also keep in mind that the name hasn't changed yet because I haven't done the reboot. So I'll need to do the reboot in order for that name change to take effect. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and close this window, and I'll close this window, and I'm going to click Start, and there's a couple of ways I can do this. One, I can click here and do a restart. I could just plain shut it down, and then when it comes back up in the future, it'll have its new server name, and it'll also have everything set up and ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and do restart. You're asked for a comment because this is a server. So we want to type something in because this is actually going to show up in our system log, which is really nice. So if somebody wants to know why their server rebooted in the future, for one thing we can say, well, this was actually planned and the reason was we want to restart to change the computer name. If you wanted to use a different reason that was planned and you don't want to type anything in and you know that it's accurate, you could use something else. But we're just going to leave it the way it is, and we're going to be very accurate in our response because we want the comment to be useful to anybody that needs to check the log in the future. If we wanted to be even more specific, we could say restart to change computer name to server. So I'll click OK and the system will reboot. Okay, so the system is booted back up, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do a quick check and make sure that I actually have successfully changed the computer name. So I'll click Administrator and type in our default password that we're using right now. And I've noticed the screen has become much smaller. Now there are ways to update the font size, which we can do. Now you may ask yourself, why is the font size as small as it is? And the reason for that is the computer that I'm on is actually on a high resolution display. So that will automatically cause the fonts to be very small. And if I know, I'm going to log in one more time, see if I get that VMware message again. So if I want to change the font size of the desktop of the virtual machine I'm using, I would do this if I had a high resolution host system. So my Mac computer here is a host system. If you have a high resolution laptop or monitor, you may want to do this to change the display. So what I'm going to do is right click inside the virtual machine and do personalize, and then go to adjust font DPI. So it's got some suggestions. It can do 96 or large, or you can do custom, and you can experiment for what works best for you. I'm going to try 140%, and I have to close in to look at it because it's so tiny on my monitor. So I'm going to click OK and apply, and it's going to ask, do I want to restart now or later? And I'm going to tell it to go ahead and restart now because I want to be able to see this virtual machine much easier. Now if you were using VirtualBox, it has built-in scaling options, so you can use VirtualBox to do the scaling and you don't have to mess with the virtual machine at all. But like I say, if I know I'm going to be using this VM frequently on this system and I'm not going to be using it someplace else, it is a good option. And again, to get the Control-Alt-Delete on a Mac, I pressed Function FN, Control, Option, and then the Delete key all at once. So I'm going to log back in as administrator and put in my default password. So the text is a little better, but again, I can even go larger and make it much more easier for me to view. So this concludes the installation of Windows Server 2008. In our next video, we're going to talk about setting up domain control and a domain for Windows Server, and in a future video we'll be setting up Windows 7 as well.